Have you ever wondered what happens when the most unlikely person becomes someone's salvation? I'm curious, especially for those of you watching from states where family means everything. How far would you go to protect someone you love? Tonight, in the heart of Miami, that question was about to be answered in the most unexpected way. Lorenzo Castillo stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him in glittering darkness. At 35, he commanded respect through fear and loyalty in equal measure, his name whispered in both reverence and terror throughout the underground networks that pulsed through South Florida like hidden arteries. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw caught the light as he turned, a permanent reminder of the night he'd learned that mercy was a luxury his world couldn't afford. His empire was built on precision, control, and the absolute certainty that his compound was impenetrable, which made the soft chiming of his security system at 12:47 in the morning particularly unusual. Lorenzo's dark eyes narrowed as he glanced at the bank of monitors built into the mahogany desk that dominated the room. His security team was the best money could buy, former military and intelligence operatives who understood that protecting Lorenzo Castillo meant protecting their own very lucrative futures. Nothing approached his property without clearance. Nothing. The infrared cameras showed a small figure at the main gate, swaying slightly in the humid Miami night. Lorenzo leaned forward, his hand automatically moving to the Glock tucked beneath his tailored jacket. The figure was tiny, child-sized, which should have been impossible. His security protocols were designed to deter anyone from approaching, especially at this hour. He pressed the intercom button that connected directly to the gatehouse. "What is it, Ramirez?" "Sir, there's a little girl here. She's asking for help. She says her sister is hurt." Lorenzo felt something cold settle in his chest. Children didn't appear at his compound. Ever. His reputation alone should have sent any sensible person running in the opposite direction, and parents in his neighborhood kept their children far away from anything connected to his name. He studied the monitor more carefully, adjusting the zoom until he could see the small figure clearly. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, wearing a torn pink t-shirt and jeans that were dirty and damp. Even through the grainy security feed, he could see that she was injured, favoring her left leg and holding her right arm close to her body. Her hair was dark and tangled, hanging around a face that should have been round with childhood innocence, but was instead pinched with pain and desperation. Something twisted in Lorenzo's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. The last time he'd seen a child in distress, it had been his sister Gabriella, bleeding out in a warehouse while he'd fought through her kidnappers too late to save her. He'd been 22 then, still learning the brutal mathematics of power and consequence. That night had carved something essential out of him, left him harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. But this child at his gate, this impossible small figure who'd somehow found her way to the most feared man in 3 counties, stirred something he'd thought was dead and buried with Gabriella. "Open the gate," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Bring her up, but keep weapons ready and scan for any other presence in the area." "Sir, are you certain? This could be a setup." Lorenzo was already moving toward the elevator, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. In his world, children were sometimes used as weapons, their innocence a cover for surveillance or assassination attempts. But his instincts, honed by years of survival in an unforgiving business, told him this was different. The way she stood, the careful way she held her injured arm, the desperate tilt of her head as she looked up at the cameras, all spoke of genuine fear and pain. "I'm certain, but maintain full perimeter watch." The elevator descended smoothly through the levels of his fortress, past the legitimate business offices on the upper floors, past the residential quarters where he entertained guests and conducted the more civilized aspects of his empire, down to the ground level where security was tightest and every visitor was thoroughly vetted before being allowed to proceed. The main entrance hall was a study in controlled intimidation, marble floors polished to mirror brightness, artwork that had been acquired through methods his accountants didn't ask about, and the kind of subtle security features that most people never noticed, but that could lock down the entire building in less than 30 seconds if necessary. Ramirez was waiting with the child, his massive frame dwarfing her tiny figure. He'd been with Lorenzo for 8 years, a former Navy SEAL who'd transitioned to private security when the legitimate world had proven too restrictive for his particular talents. His expression was carefully neutral, but Lorenzo could see the uncertainty in his eyes. In their line of work, children represented complications that none of them were trained to handle. The girl looked up when Lorenzo approached, and he felt another unexpected punch of recognition. Her eyes were enormous, dark brown and liquid with unshed tears, but there was something fierce in them too, a stubborn determination that reminded him painfully of Gabriella in her final moments. She was indeed injured, her lips split and swelling, bruises darkening along her jaw and disappearing beneath her torn shirt collar. "Hello," Lorenzo said, crouching down so that he was closer to her eye level. His voice came out gentler than he'd intended, rusty from disuse. "Ramirez tells me you need help. What's your name?" "Sophia," she whispered, her voice barely audible but steady. "My sister Elena is hurt really bad. She told me to find the strongest person I could and ask for help. Someone said you were the strongest person in the whole neighborhood." Lorenzo felt his jaw clench. Someone had sent a child, an injured child, to seek help from a man whose reputation was built on violence and fear. Either someone was playing a very dangerous game, or this Elena was desperate enough to risk everything for her sister's safety. "Where's your sister, Sophia?" She pointed toward the street with her uninjured arm. "In the alley by the church. She can't walk and there's blood, and I was scared she was going to stop breathing. I tried to wake her up, but she just made hurt sounds." Every protective instinct Lorenzo had thought was dead roared to life. Without conscious thought, he was already moving toward the door, gesturing for Ramirez to follow. Sophia hurried after them as fast as her injured leg would allow, her small hand catching the edge of Lorenzo's jacket with surprising strength. The alley she led them to was 3 blocks from his compound, a narrow space between an old Catholic church and a shuttered grocery store where shadows pooled thick enough to hide anything. Lorenzo's security training kicked in automatically as they approached, his eyes scanning for threats, his body positioned to shield Sophia while Ramirez took point. Elena Moreau lay crumpled against a dumpster, unconscious and breathing shallowly. Even in the dim light from the single working street lamp, Lorenzo could see that she'd been beaten severely. Her face was swollen, her left eye completely closed, blood matting her dark blonde hair where it had dried against her scalp. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her jeans ripped at the knee where gravel had scraped away skin. But even unconscious and battered, there was something about her that made Lorenzo's breath catch. She was probably in her mid-20s, with delicate features that were beautiful despite the damage that had been done to them. Her body was positioned protectively even in unconsciousness, her arms curved as if she'd been trying to shield something, probably Sophia, when the attack had happened. Lorenzo knelt beside her, his fingers automatically checking for a pulse at her throat. Her skin was warm but clammy, her heartbeat steady but weak. He'd seen enough violence in his life to recognize the signs of a serious beating, but also to know that she was stable enough to move if they were careful. "Ramirez, call Dr. Martinez. Tell him it's an emergency consultation at the compound. Sophia, I need you to tell me what happened. Can you do that?" Sophia nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "We were staying at the motel because Elena said we had to leave our apartment fast. But Marcus found us anyway. He was really mad and he kept hitting Elena and saying she belonged to him and couldn't leave. Elena told me to run and hide, but I couldn't leave her. When Marcus finally went away, Elena couldn't get up. She told me to find someone strong enough to make Marcus stop forever." Lorenzo felt rage building in his chest, cold and precise and absolutely deadly. He'd built his reputation on being the kind of man who solved problems permanently, and Marcus, whoever he was, had just become a very serious problem. Ramirez appeared at his shoulder. "Dr. Martinez is en route. Should I call for a stretcher team?" "No, I'll carry her." Lorenzo slipped his arms carefully beneath Elena's shoulders and knees, lifting her as gently as he could manage. She was lighter than he'd expected, her body limp and vulnerable in his arms. Something protective and possessive stirred in him as he adjusted his grip, making sure her head was supported against his chest. He could smell her shampoo beneath the scent of fear and pain, something clean and floral that spoke of a life very different from his own. Sophia walked beside him as they made their way back to the compound, her small hand resting on Lorenzo's arm as if she needed the contact to believe that help had finally arrived. The child's trust was absolute and terrifying, a responsibility Lorenzo hadn't asked for but found himself accepting with surprising ease. Dr. Martinez was waiting when they arrived, a discreet man in his 60s who'd been treating Lorenzo's people for years without asking uncomfortable questions. He took one look at Elena and directed them to the medical suite that Lorenzo maintained on the 3rd floor, a fully equipped facility that could handle everything from bullet wounds to emergency surgery. As they settled Elena onto the examination table, Lorenzo found himself reluctant to let go of her. There was something about the way she'd felt in his arms, fragile but not breakable, that made him want to continue protecting her. He stepped back only when Dr. Martinez began his examination, but he remained close enough to intervene if needed. Sophia climbed into the chair beside the examination table, her eyes never leaving her sister's face. She's gonna be okay, right? Elena always says she's too stubborn to die, but she looks really hurt. Dr. Martinez glanced up from his assessment, his expression cautiously optimistic. She has a concussion, several cracked ribs, and extensive bruising, but nothing that won't heal with time and rest. She's lucky, though. A few more minutes, and we might have been dealing with internal bleeding. Lorenzo felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Elena would recover, which meant he had time to figure out what to do about Marcus and the larger situation that had brought these two damaged souls to his doorstep. It was another hour before Elena began to stir, her eyelids fluttering as consciousness slowly returned. Sophia was immediately at her side, her small hand gripping her sister's fingers tightly. Elena? Elena, please wake up. I found help like you said. I found someone really strong. Elena's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening with alarm as she realized she was in an unfamiliar place. She tried to sit up, immediately wincing as her injuries protested the movement. Sophia, where are we? Are you hurt? Did he come back? Her voice was hoarse but fierce, and Lorenzo could see the exact moment when her protective instincts overrode her own pain. She was scanning the room for threats, positioning herself between Sophia and any potential danger despite the fact that she could barely move. It's okay, Elena. Lorenzo kept his voice calm and non-threatening, the same tone he used when negotiating with particularly skittish business partners. You're safe. Both of you are safe. Elena's gaze snapped to him, her brown eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. Who are you? Where are we? Sophia, come here right now. But Sophia didn't move away from Lorenzo's side. This is Lorenzo, Elena. He helped us. He carried you all the way here, and the doctor fixed you up and everything. Elena struggled to sit up again, this time managing to prop herself against the headboard despite her obvious pain. Lorenzo could see her taking in his expensive clothes, the quality of the medical equipment around them, the subtle signs of wealth and power that surrounded him like an aura. What do you want? She asked, her voice steadier now, but still wary. Nobody helps strangers for nothing, especially not strangers like us. Lorenzo found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes despite the fear, the way she'd immediately positioned herself to protect Sophia even when she was barely conscious. There was something compelling about Elena Moreau, something that went beyond her beauty to touch something deeper in him. Right now, I want you to rest and heal, he said simply. Tomorrow, we can talk about what comes next. Elena's eyes narrowed. I don't know what kind of operation you're running here, but we can't pay you. We don't have anything valuable, and I won't trade favors for help. Sophia and I will leave as soon as I can walk. The determination in her voice was absolute, and Lorenzo felt a reluctant admiration for her strength. Even battered and vulnerable, she was thinking first of Sophia's safety and their independence. It was exactly the kind of fierce protectiveness he'd seen in his sister, the quality that had gotten Gabriella killed when she'd refused to back down from a fight she couldn't win. Ms. Moreau, he said quietly, you're not in any condition to leave, and from what Sophia has told me, the man who did this to you isn't finished. Stay tonight. Let yourself heal. We can discuss terms in the morning. Elena's gaze searched his face, looking for deception or hidden motives. Lorenzo kept his expression carefully neutral, though something in her scrutiny made him want to prove himself worthy of her trust. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. One night. But I want your word that Sophia won't be involved in whatever business you're really in. You have it. As Elena settled back against the pillows, exhaustion finally overtaking her adrenaline, Lorenzo found himself watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. Something had shifted in the space of a few hours, some fundamental change in the carefully ordered world he'd built around himself. For the first time in 13 years, Lorenzo Castillo was responsible for someone other than himself, and the weight of that responsibility felt both terrifying and strangely right. Sophia had curled up in the chair beside her sister's bed, finally allowing sleep to claim her now that Elena was safe. The sight of the child's peaceful face, unmarked by the fear and pain that had driven her to his gates, made Lorenzo's chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Whatever came next, whoever Marcus was and whatever he represented, Lorenzo would handle it. Elena and Sophia were under his protection now, and in his world, that meant something absolute and unbreakable. He'd failed to protect Gabriella, but he wouldn't fail again. Elena woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been pancakes, which was impossible because she hadn't woken up to the smell of breakfast in over 2 years. The morning light streaming through unfamiliar windows reminded her immediately that she wasn't in the cramped motel room where Marcus had found them, wasn't in their old apartment where she'd spent months walking on eggshells and planning their escape. She was in the compound of a man she knew nothing about except that he'd carried her to safety when Sophia had begged him for help. The medical suite was empty except for her, though she could hear Sophia's laughter echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. The sound was so startling that Elena sat up too quickly, her ribs protesting the movement with sharp stabs of pain. When was the last time she'd heard Sophia laugh like that? Without reservation or fear. Before Marcus, definitely. Maybe not since their parents had died in the car accident 3 years ago, leaving Elena to raise her 80-year-old sister on a waitress's salary and sheer determination. Elena swung her legs over the side of the medical bed, testing her balance. Dr. Martinez had been thorough in his examination the night before, cleaning her wounds and wrapping her ribs, but the pain medication was wearing off, and every movement reminded her of Marcus's fists and boots. She needed to find Sophia, needed to understand exactly where they were, and what this Lorenzo person expected in return for his help. The hallway outside the medical suite was elegant in a way that spoke of serious money, the kind of quiet luxury that Elena had only seen in magazines. Hardwood floors polished to a mirror shine, artwork that looked original and expensive, crown molding that probably cost more than Elena made in 6 months. This wasn't the home of a legitimate businessman, not with the subtle security features she was beginning to notice. Cameras positioned to watch every angle, reinforced door frames, the kind of attention to defensive detail that suggested someone who had enemies. Sophia's voice led Elena deeper into the building, through a living area that could have housed 3 families and into a kitchen that belonged in a 5-star restaurant. The sight that greeted her there made Elena's breath catch in her throat and her protective instincts flare simultaneously. Sophia was perched on a bar stool at the massive kitchen island, still wearing yesterday's torn clothes, but somehow looking more relaxed than Elena had seen her in months. Across from her, Lorenzo Castillo was flipping pancakes with surprising competence, his expensive shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked with scars that suggested a violent past. In daylight, Lorenzo was even more intimidating than he'd seemed the night before. Probably 6 foot low and built like someone who stayed in fighting shape, with the kind of presence that made the enormous kitchen feel smaller just by his occupying it. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his olive skin unmarked except for that scar along his jaw and another that disappeared beneath his shirt collar. But it was his eyes that caught Elena's attention, dark brown and intelligent, watching Sophia with an expression of genuine warmth that seemed completely at odds with everything else about him. "Elena, you're awake," Sophia called, bouncing slightly on her stool. "Lorenzo makes really good pancakes, and he said I could have chocolate chips in mine, and he has orange juice that tastes like it comes from actual oranges instead of powder." The domestic scene was so surreal that Elena had to grip the doorframe for support. Men like Lorenzo, men who lived in compounds with security cameras and medical suites, didn't make chocolate chip pancakes for strange children. There had to be an angle, some expectation or payment that Elena hadn't figured out yet. "How are you feeling?" Lorenzo asked, his voice carefully neutral as he plated Sophia's pancakes and slid them across the island. Dr. Martinez left some stronger pain medication if you need it. I'm fine, Elena said automatically, though she wasn't fine at all. Her head was pounding. Her ribs felt like they'd been used for batting practice, and every muscle in her body ached. More importantly, she was standing in the kitchen of a complete stranger who had enough money and power to terrify her, dependent on his charity with no way to repay him and no clear exit strategy. Sophia rolled her eyes with 80-year-old exasperation. Elena always says she's fine even when she's not. She said she was fine when she had the flu last month and couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. Lorenzo's mouth quirked upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. That sounds familiar. I had a sister who did the same thing. Had. Past tense. Elena filed that information away along with everything else she was learning about Lorenzo Castillo. The expensive home, the medical suite, the casual reference to lost family, all painted a picture of someone with resources and pain in equal measure. Mr. Castillo, Elena started, but he interrupted gently. Lorenzo, and you need to eat something before we talk. Dr. Martinez was very specific about that. As if summoned by the mention of food, Elena's stomach growled loudly enough to make Sophia giggle. Elena realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal, too focused on keeping them moving and staying ahead of Marcus to think about basic necessities like nutrition. Lorenzo placed a plate in front of her without waiting for permission. Pancakes topped with fresh berries and accompanied by crispy bacon that smelled better than anything Elena had tasted in months. The gesture was casual but somehow intimate, the kind of caretaking that Elena hadn't experienced since before her parents died. You said we could talk this morning, Elena said, accepting the fork Lorenzo offered but keeping her voice firm. About what comes next. Lorenzo poured himself coffee from an expensive-looking machine, his movements deliberate and controlled. First, I need to know more about Marcus. Last name, where he works, what kind of resources he has access to. Elena's hand tightened on her fork. Why does that matter? Sophia and I just need to get far enough away that he can't find us. We've been planning this for months. Because Marcus Volkov isn't just some abusive boyfriend with anger management problems, Lorenzo said quietly. My people ran his name last night. He's connected to the Bratva, specifically the Kozlov organization that runs trafficking operations through the port. He also has at least 3 cops on his payroll and connections to immigration services. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The Bratva. She'd heard whispers about Russian organized crime in Miami, stories that seemed too brutal to be true. If Marcus was connected to them, if he had police protection and immigration contacts, then running was pointless. They'd find her and Sophia anywhere in the country. How do you know all this? She whispered. Because I'm Lorenzo Castillo, and information is how I stay alive in my business. The name meant nothing to Elena, but the way Lorenzo said it, with quiet certainty and complete confidence, told her she should recognize it. Sophia was focused on her pancakes, apparently unconcerned by the adult conversation happening around her, but Elena could feel the weight of Lorenzo's attention like a physical presence. What business would that be? Elena asked, though she was beginning to understand that she didn't want to know the answer. I run the largest independent operation in South Florida. Shipping, transportation, security consulting. My organization handles problems that can't be solved through official channels. The euphemisms were elegant, but Elena wasn't naive. Independent operation meant criminal enterprise. Problems that couldn't be solved officially meant violence and intimidation. Lorenzo Castillo was exactly the kind of dangerous man Elena had spent her life avoiding, the kind of man her parents had warned her against when they'd moved the family away from the rough neighborhood where Elena had been born. But he'd also saved Sophia's life and her own, had provided medical care and safety and chocolate chip pancakes without asking for anything in return. What do you want from us? Elena asked directly. Lorenzo studied her face for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Right now? I want you to heal, and I want Sophia to be safe while you figure out your next move. Beyond that, we can negotiate. Elena felt tears prick behind her eyes, though whether from relief or frustration, she couldn't tell. She'd spent so long being strong for Sophia, making all the decisions and carrying all the responsibility, that having someone else offer to help felt almost too good to be true. I can't pay you, she said again. I have about $400 to my name and no way to get more without a job, and I can't work while I look like this. Did I ask you for money? No, but nothing's free. You'll want something eventually. Lorenzo's expression softened slightly, and Elena caught a glimpse of whatever Sophia had seen in him that morning, some fundamental gentleness that existed beneath the controlled exterior. Elena, I've been where you are. Maybe not exactly, but I know what it's like to be responsible for someone you love when the world is trying to hurt them. I know what it's like to feel like you're failing at the most important job you'll ever have. The words hit Elena harder than Marcus's fists had, cutting straight through her defenses to touch the fear she'd been carrying for months. She was failing Sophia. Despite all her planning and sacrifice, Elena had led them directly into Marcus's hands, and if Lorenzo hadn't intervened, Sophia might have watched her sister die in that alley. I raised Sophia alone since she was 5, Elena said, her voice barely steady. Our parents died, and I was all she had left. I thought I could protect her from everything, but I couldn't even protect her from my own bad choices. Sophia looked up from her pancakes with the kind of serious expression that looked wrong on such a young face. Elena, you did protect me. You got us away from Marcus, and when he found us you told me exactly what to do to get help. That's protection. Lorenzo nodded, his gaze never leaving Elena's face. Sophia's right. You made the hard choice to send her for help instead of trying to handle everything yourself. That took courage. Elena felt something crack open in her chest, some tight knot of fear and responsibility that had been choking her for months. When was the last time someone had told her she was doing a good job? When had anyone acknowledged that keeping Sophia safe and fed and enrolled in school, while working double shifts and dodging an increasingly violent ex-boyfriend, might actually be an accomplishment worth recognizing? Here's what I propose, Lorenzo continued, his voice gentle but businesslike. You and Sophia stay here while you recover. I'll have my people monitor Marcus's activities and keep him away from both of you. In exchange, you help me understand how to make Sophia comfortable here. I'm not exactly experienced with children. Elena looked at Sophia, who was listening with the intensity of someone much older than 8. It wasn't ideal, accepting help from a criminal, even one who made excellent pancakes and treated her sister with genuine kindness. But the alternative was running blind with an injured body and a traumatized child, hoping they could stay ahead of someone with resources and connections they couldn't match. How long? Elena asked. Until it's safe for you to leave, or until you decide you want to make different arrangements. The open-ended nature of the offer should have been alarming, but Elena found it oddly comforting. For the first time in months, she didn't have to have a complete plan. She didn't have to know exactly where they would sleep tomorrow night, or how she would pay for Sophia's next meal. Okay, she said quietly. Temporary arrangement. But I want to contribute somehow. I'm not a charity case. Lorenzo's smile was small, but genuine. We'll figure something out. As Elena ate her first real breakfast in weeks and watched Sophia chatter happily about the swimming pool she'd glimpsed through one of the windows, she tried to ignore the way Lorenzo's presence made her feel safer than she had in years. He was dangerous. Possibly more dangerous than Marcus, but he was dangerous in a protective way that made Elena want to trust him despite every rational thought in her head. It was a mistake she'd made before, trusting someone who seemed strong enough to take care of her problems. But as Lorenzo gently corrected Sophia's table manners and asked thoughtful questions about her favorite subjects in school, Elena found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found someone who was strong enough to protect what mattered most. Elena had been in Lorenzo's compound for 3 days when she first witnessed him at work, and the experience left her with a new understanding of exactly who had taken them under his protection. She'd been looking for Sophia, who had a talent for disappearing into the massive house's many rooms, when voices from Lorenzo's office drew her attention. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, she could see Lorenzo seated behind his imposing mahogany desk, facing 3 men who radiated the kind of nervous energy that suggested they were delivering news he wouldn't want to hear. The shipment from Cartagena is 3 days late, one of them was saying, a thin man with graying hair and expensive shoes. The contact claims weather delays, but our sources suggest the authorities might be involved. Lorenzo's voice when he responded was nothing like the gentle tone he used with Sophia or the careful courtesy he showed Elena. It was cold and precise, carrying an authority that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Ramirez, I want confirmation on the official involvement within 6 hours. If there's been a leak, find it and plug it permanently. Marco, contact our backup suppliers in Colombia. We'll need replacement inventory by next week, or we'll lose the Garcia contract. Elena found herself pressed against the wall beside the door, her heart racing as she listened to Lorenzo orchestrate what was clearly a complex criminal operation. The casual mention of permanent solutions and backup suppliers painted a picture of someone who commanded vast resources and wasn't hesitant about using violence when necessary. But what struck her most was the intelligence behind his orders, the way he saw 3 steps ahead of every problem and had contingencies for situations she couldn't even imagine. This wasn't some street-level criminal struggling to maintain territory. This was a businessman who happened to operate outside the law, someone who'd built an empire through strategic thinking and careful planning. The third man, younger than the others, leaned forward with obvious concern. What about the Volkov situation? Marcus has been asking questions about the compound, trying to get information from some of our lower-level contacts. Elena's blood turned to ice at the mention of Marcus's name. She'd known he wouldn't give up easily, but hearing confirmation that he was actively hunting them made her knees weak with renewed fear. Lorenzo's response was immediate and absolute. Marcus Volkov is not to get within 5 miles of this property or anyone under my protection. Make sure our people understand that interfering with my household security is a career-ending decision. If he keeps pushing, we'll resolve the problem more directly. The meeting continued for another few minutes, but Elena had heard enough. She slipped away from the door on unsteady legs, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd overheard. Marcus was still hunting them, still determined to drag her back into the nightmare she'd escaped. But more unsettling was the realization that Lorenzo's protection came with a level of violence she'd never fully comprehended. She found Sophia in the library, a room that could have belonged in a university with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and comfortable reading chairs. Sophia was curled up with a picture book, but she looked up with immediate concern when Elena entered. "Elena, you look scared. Did something happen?" Elena forced a smile, settling into the chair beside Sophia's. "No, sweetheart. I just realized how big this house is. I got a little lost." It was a partial truth, but Elena had learned years ago that Sophia didn't need to carry the weight of every adult worry. The child had already seen too much violence, had already been forced to grow up too quickly because of Elena's poor choices in men. Lorenzo appeared in the library doorway as if summoned by their conversation, and Elena wondered if he'd somehow sensed her presence outside his office. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the remnants of the cold authority she'd witnessed during his meeting. "Sophia, I have something I'd like to discuss with you," he said, his voice returning to the gentle tone he used with the child. "Would you like to continue going to school while you're staying here?" Sophia's face lit up with excitement. "Really? I thought I'd have to miss lots of days like when we were moving around before." Elena felt her throat tighten. Sophia had already missed 3 weeks of 3rd grade because of their attempts to evade Marcus, and Elena had been terrified about the impact on her sister's education. She'd try to help with homework when they could find quiet moments in motel rooms, but she was no substitute for actual classroom instruction. "I've arranged for enrollment at St. Catherine's Academy," Lorenzo continued. "It's a private school about 10 minutes from here, with excellent security and small classes. You'll need some new uniforms and supplies, but we can take care of that this afternoon." Elena's automatic response was to refuse, to insist that she couldn't accept such expensive help, but the hope on Sophia's face stopped the words before they could form. How long had it been since her sister had looked forward to anything? How many normal childhood experiences had Elena's mistakes already cost her? "That sounds wonderful," Elena said quietly. "Thank you." Lorenzo's gaze met hers across the room, and she saw understanding in his dark eyes. He knew exactly what this gesture meant to both of them, knew that Elena's pride was less important than Sophia's need for stability and education. That afternoon, Elena found herself in the passenger seat of Lorenzo's Mercedes as they drove to the upscale shopping center where St. Catherine's Academy had its uniform supplier. Sophia chattered excitedly from the back seat about her new school, her bruises faded enough that she looked like any normal 80-year-old preparing for a new adventure. Elena watched Lorenzo as he navigated traffic with the same controlled competence he brought to everything else, one hand resting casually on the steering wheel while he pointed out landmarks to Sophia. He'd changed from his business attire into dark jeans and a button-down shirt that made him look younger and somehow more approachable. Though Elena was painfully aware of the gun she'd glimpsed beneath his jacket when he'd helped her into the car. "You don't have to do this," Elena said when Sophia was distracted by something outside her window. "The school enrollment, the uniforms. It's too much." Lorenzo glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "When I was Sophia's age, my sister Gabriella was 10. Our parents worked constantly just to keep food on the table, so Gabriella took care of me most of the time. Made sure I did my homework, walked me to school, stood between me and the older kids who thought I was an easy target." Elena could hear the pain beneath his matter-of-fact tone, the weight of loss that he carried carefully but couldn't quite hide. "She sounds like she was wonderful. She was everything to me. Smart, fearless, determined to make sure I had opportunities she'd never get. When she died, I promised myself I'd never let another child suffer because the adults in their life couldn't protect them." Elena felt tears prick behind her eyes as understanding dawned. Lorenzo wasn't helping Sophia out of charity or obligation. He was honoring the memory of a sister who died too young, trying to give Sophia the protection and stability that Gabriella had never received. "How old was she?" Elena asked softly. 16. "She was trying to protect me from some very bad people, and she made choices that got her killed. I was too young and too powerless to save her." Elena reached across the console without thinking, covering Lorenzo's hand with her own. His skin was warm and marked with small scars, evidence of a life lived dangerously, but his fingers were gentle when they turned to intertwine with hers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The contact sent awareness shooting through Elena's entire body, a recognition that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the growing attraction she'd been trying to ignore. Lorenzo's hand was strong and protective, the same hand that had carried her to safety and flipped pancakes for Sophia, but also the hand that commanded an empire built on violence. When they returned to the compound that evening, Sophia's arms full of school supplies and new uniforms, Elena helped her sister organize everything for the first day of school. It was a domestic routine that felt almost normal, if she could ignore the armed security guards and bulletproof windows that defined their current reality. Lorenzo appeared in the doorway as Elena was reading Sophia a bedtime story, something that had become tradition in their nomadic life as a way of maintaining stability no matter where they were sleeping. He leaned against the doorframe, listening as Elena did different voices for each character, and Sophia giggled at the dramatic renditions. "You're good at that," he said when Elena finished the story and Sophia was settling down for sleep. "Practice," Elena replied, smoothing Sophia's hair back from her forehead. "We've had a lot of hotel rooms and borrowed couches over the past few months. Stories help make any place feel safer." The three of them had formed an oddly comfortable evening routine over the past few days. Lorenzo would finish his business for the day. They'd share dinner in the kitchen while Sophia told them about whatever she'd discovered in the house, then migrate to the living room, where Sophia would curl up between them on the massive sofa while they watched movies appropriate for 80-year-olds. Elena found herself looking forward to these quiet hours more than she should, treasuring the way Lorenzo's presence made both her and Sophia feel protected and cared for. It was dangerous to get used to this kind of security, dangerous to start depending on someone whose world was so different from her own. When Sophia was finally asleep, Elena and Lorenzo moved to the kitchen where he made tea, and she tried to ignore how domestic the whole scene felt. She was acutely aware of him moving around the familiar space, the easy competence with which he handled even simple tasks like finding mugs and honey. "Your ribs are healing well," he observed as Elena reached for something on a high shelf without wincing. "Dr. Martinez said you could probably return to normal activities within the week." Elena nodded, though the prospect of normal activities seemed impossibly complex when she didn't know what normal looked like anymore. Going back to waitressing felt like a fantasy when Marcus was still hunting them, and she had no idea how to build a life for Sophia that didn't involve looking over their shoulders constantly. "Lorenzo," she said, then stopped, unsure how to voice the fears that kept her awake at night. "What is it?" "I'm scared of trusting anyone with Sophia's safety," she admitted, the words coming out in a rush. Before my parents died, I thought I could trust people to help and protect the people I loved. But I was wrong so many times that now I don't know how to tell the difference between someone who actually cares and someone who just wants something from me. Lorenzo set down his tea and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious and intent. Elena, I can't promise you that trusting me won't involve risk. My world is dangerous, and people who get close to me sometimes get hurt because of it. But I can promise you that Sophia's safety and happiness matter to me now, not because of what you might give me in return, but because she matters. Because you both matter. The sincerity in his voice made Elena's chest tight with emotion she didn't know how to process. When had someone last told her that she mattered? When had anyone looked at her like she was worth protecting just for her own sake? Before Elena could respond, Lorenzo's phone buzzed with an incoming text message. His expression darkened as he read it, and Elena felt her stomach drop with renewed fear. What is it? Marcus. He sent a message through one of my contacts. He knows you're here. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as Lorenzo showed her the phone screen. The message was short but unmistakably threatening. Tell your boss his new pets belong to me. I always collect what's mine. He's never going to stop, Elena whispered, her voice breaking with despair. He'll keep hunting us until he drags us back or gets us killed. Lorenzo's jaw tightened with an expression Elena was beginning to recognize as his planning face. The look he got when he was seeing 3 steps ahead of a problem and calculating solutions. Yes, he will, Lorenzo agreed quietly. Which means we're going to have to stop him first. The words should have terrified Elena, should have made her grab Sophia and run before she got them entangled in a war between dangerous men. Instead, she felt something like relief settle in her chest. For the first time since Marcus had become a threat, someone was willing to do more than help her hide. Someone was willing to fight back. As Lorenzo began making phone calls to increase their security and gather intelligence on Marcus's movements, Elena found herself watching him with a new understanding. He wasn't just offering them temporary sanctuary anymore. He was preparing to eliminate the threat that had been hanging over them for months. And despite everything Elena had learned about the violence that defined Lorenzo's world, she couldn't bring herself to feel anything but grateful. Elena's phone rang at 2:15 in the afternoon while she was organizing Sophia's new school supplies, and the caller ID made her blood turn to ice. St. Catherine's Academy. Sophia had only been enrolled for 1 week, barely long enough to settle into her new routine, but Elena's mind immediately jumped to every possible disaster. Ms. Moreau, this is Principal Davies at St. Catherine's. Sophia is perfectly safe, but there's been an incident that requires your immediate attention. Elena's hands shook as she grabbed her purse and keys, her heart hammering against her ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with her healing injuries and everything to do with maternal terror. She was halfway to the garage before she remembered that Lorenzo had insisted on providing transportation anywhere Sophia might be involved, a security measure that had seemed excessive until this moment. Ramirez appeared before she could reach the Mercedes, his expression grim but reassuring. Mr. Castillo is already en route to the school. He sent me to bring you there safely. The drive to St. Catherine's felt endless despite Ramirez's efficient navigation through Miami traffic. Elena stared out the window at the familiar streets, trying to control the panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. Marcus had found Sophia. Somehow, despite Lorenzo's security measures and the school's supposed safety protocols, Marcus had gotten close enough to her sister to create an incident that required parental notification. When they arrived at the academy, Elena could see Lorenzo's black SUV parked in the circular drive, along with 2 additional vehicles that she didn't recognize. Security personnel in expensive suits were positioned around the entrance, their presence subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Elena found Lorenzo in Principal Davies's office, his controlled fury evident in every line of his body despite his carefully neutral expression. Sophia was curled up in his lap, seemingly unharmed but pressed against his chest like she was seeking protection from something that had genuinely terrified her. Elena, Sophia said when she saw her sister, immediately reaching for her with both arms. A bad man came to my school, and he knew my name, and he said he was going to take me to see you. Elena felt the world tilt sideways as she gathered Sophia into her arms, checking frantically for any signs of injury or distress. Her sister was physically unharmed, but Elena could feel the fine tremor in Sophia's small body. the way she clung with desperate strength. Principal Davies cleared his throat diplomatically. A man identifying himself as Marcus Volkov approached Sophia during outdoor recess, claiming to be a family friend sent to collect her for a doctor's appointment. Fortunately, our security protocols require verification for any unexpected pickup requests, and when we attempted to contact you, the man became agitated and fled the premises. He got on a school property? Elena's voice came out sharper than she intended, her protective instincts overriding any concern for politeness. Our initial investigation suggests he posed as a maintenance worker to gain access to the grounds, Lorenzo said, his tone carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of violence that made Elena shiver. It won't happen again. Elena looked at Principal Davies, whose expression suggested he understood exactly who Lorenzo was and why his assurance carried absolute certainty. We're reviewing all of our security procedures, the principal said quickly. St. Catherine's takes the safety of our students very seriously, and we're implementing additional measures to ensure this type of breach cannot occur again. The drive back to Lorenzo's compound was silent except for Sophia's occasional sniffles as she processed her frightening experience. Elena held her sister in the back seat, her mind racing with implications and fears that threatened to paralyze her. Marcus had been close enough to touch Sophia, close enough to take her if the school's procedures hadn't intervened. If Lorenzo's reputation hadn't prompted extra caution from the staff. Elena didn't realize she was crying until Lorenzo handed her a tissue as they pulled through the compound gates. The simple gesture of care, combined with the relief of being back in their safe space, broke through the control she'd been maintaining since the phone call. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Sophia's quiet humming as she played with a toy Lorenzo kept in the car for her entertainment. "I thought I could keep her safe, but I can't. Every choice I make puts her in more danger." Lorenzo's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, dark and understanding and absolutely certain. "You're not doing this alone anymore, Elena. We're going to end this threat permanently." That evening, after Sophia was settled with a movie and extra security stationed throughout the house, Elena found herself pacing Lorenzo's office like a caged animal. Her fear had crystallized into something harder and more focused, a desperation that demanded action rather than the careful planning Lorenzo seemed to favor. "He has to be stopped," she said for the third time, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I don't care what it takes or what it costs. I won't let him terrorize Sophia anymore." Lorenzo watched her pace from behind his desk, his expression patient but alert. The afternoon's events had stripped away the last of Elena's reservations about his world and methods. If violence was the language Marcus understood, then Elena was ready to speak it fluently. "Elena," Lorenzo said quietly, and something in his tone made her stop moving to look at him directly. "Come here." She approached his desk cautiously, unsure what he intended but drawn by the gentle command in his voice. When she was close enough to touch, Lorenzo stood and moved around the desk to face her, his hands settling carefully on her shoulders. "I need you to understand something," he said, his dark eyes searching her face. "When I eliminate Marcus, it won't be because you asked me to. It will be because he threatened you and Sophia, and that makes him my enemy. My choice, my responsibility, my methods." Elena felt something break open in her chest at his words, some last wall of resistance crumbling under the weight of his absolute commitment to their protection. He was taking the burden from her shoulders, accepting the moral weight of whatever needed to be done. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for us?" "Because somewhere between Sophia trusting me enough to ask for help and watching you read her bedtime stories, you both became mine to protect," Lorenzo said, his thumbs stroking gently over her collarbones. "Because I haven't felt this kind of purpose since Gabriella died, and I'm not willing to lose it again." The confession hung between them for a moment, heavy with implications that Elena was finally ready to acknowledge. She'd been fighting her attraction to Lorenzo since that first morning in his kitchen, telling herself it was gratitude or Stockholm Syndrome or simple proximity. But standing in his arms, seeing the vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior, she couldn't deny the truth anymore. "I'm terrified of trusting you," she admitted, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. "Everything I know about men like you tells me I should run. But I can't anymore, Lorenzo. I don't want to." "Men like me?" Lorenzo's mouth quirked upward in a small smile that didn't quite hide the hurt in his eyes. Dangerous men. Powerful men who could destroy my life if they chose to. Elena, I would never hurt you or Sophia. You have to know that by now. I do know that, Elena said, her voice stronger now. That's what terrifies me. I know you'd protect us with your life, and I know you'd kill anyone who threatened us. And I know that Sophia already loves you like a father. I know I'm falling in love with you despite every rational thought in my head. Lorenzo's hands tightened on her shoulders, his dark eyes heating with something that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. There's nothing rational about this, he agreed quietly. I've built my life around control and careful planning. And then you and Sophia appeared and turned everything upside down. I should send you somewhere safe and handle Marcus from a distance, but I can't let you go. Elena rose on her toes, closing the distance between them until she could feel his breath against her lips. Then don't let me go. Lorenzo's mouth covered hers with a hunger that spoke of weeks of restraint finally breaking, his arms pulling her against him like he needed the contact to breathe. Elena melted into the kiss, her hands fisting in his shirt as she surrendered to the desire she'd been fighting since that first morning when he'd carried her to safety. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Lorenzo rested his forehead against hers. Elena, if we do this, there's no going back. My world doesn't allow for casual relationships or temporary arrangements. If you're mine completely. The possessive certainty in his voice should have triggered Elena's need for independence, but instead it sent heat spiraling through her entire body. After months of feeling powerless and alone, the idea of belonging to someone strong enough to protect what mattered most was intoxicating. I want to be yours, she whispered against his mouth. I want Sophia to be safe, and I want to stop running, and I want to fall asleep in your arms knowing that tomorrow we'll still be together. Lorenzo lifted her easily, settling her on the edge of his desk as he moved between her knees, his mouth finding the sensitive spot beneath her ear that made her gasp and arch against him. You're sure? He asked, his voice rough with desire but still careful, still giving her room to change her mind. Elena answered by pulling his mouth back to hers, pouring all of her trust and need and desperate love into the kiss. Lorenzo responded with a reverence that made tears prick behind her eyes, his hands gentle but possessive as they explored the body he'd been protecting for weeks. Later, when they were tangled together on the massive sofa in Lorenzo's private suite, Elena traced the scars on his chest and marveled at how safe she felt despite everything logical telling her this was the most dangerous thing she'd ever done. What happens now? She asked, her head pillowed on his shoulder as his fingers combed through her hair. Now we handle Marcus, and then we figure out how to build a life together, Lorenzo said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. However long it takes, whatever it costs, we make this work. Elena closed her eyes and let herself believe, for the first time in years, that someone else would help carry the weight of keeping Sophia safe. In Lorenzo's arms, with his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, tomorrow felt like a promise instead of a threat. Elena woke to the sound of Sophia's laughter echoing from the kitchen, a sound that had become as natural as breathing over the past 2 weeks. What made her pause in the doorway, however, was the word that followed that bright giggle. Papa, can you make the pancakes shaped like butterflies again? Elena doesn't believe you can really do it. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she watched Lorenzo's expression transform, something raw and vulnerable flickering across his features before being replaced by the gentle smile he reserved for Sophia. He was standing at the stove in a white t-shirt and jeans, more relaxed than Elena had ever seen him, flour dusting his forearms as he attempted to create butterfly-shaped pancakes for an 80-year-old who had claimed his heart as completely as she'd claimed Elena's. I think I can manage butterflies, Lorenzo said, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. But you'll have to help me with the wings. They're the tricky part. Elena remained in the doorway, watching the domestic scene unfold with a mixture of joy and terror that threatened to overwhelm her. When had Sophia started calling Lorenzo Papa? When had this dangerous man who commanded an empire through violence and fear become the father figure her sister had never had? Elena, you're being sneaky, Sophia called without turning around. Lorenzo, Elena's trying to spy on us from the doorway. Lorenzo looked up, meeting Elena's gaze across the kitchen with an expression that asked the question neither of them had been brave enough to voice. They were playing house in the middle of a war zone, building a family while Marcus still posed a threat that could destroy everything they were creating. "Good morning, Cara," Lorenzo said softly, the endearment rolling off his tongue like he'd been using it for years instead of days. Elena crossed to where he stood, rising on her toes to kiss him good morning while Sophia made exaggerated gagging sounds behind them. The simple domesticity of it, the way Lorenzo's arm automatically curved around her waist while he continued cooking with his free hand, felt like everything Elena had never known she wanted. "Dr. Martinez called this morning," Lorenzo said against her ear, his voice low enough that Sophia couldn't hear. "Your ribs are fully healed, and Sophia's bruises are completely gone. Physically, you're both recovered from Marcus's attack." Elena nodded, understanding the implication. They were no longer staying because of medical necessity. They were staying because they'd chosen to build something together, something that felt increasingly permanent despite the dangerous foundation it rested on. The morning routine was interrupted by Ramirez's arrival, his expression more serious than usual as he handed Lorenzo a tablet containing what looked like surveillance photos and intelligence reports. "Sir, we've identified the full scope of Marcus's operation. He's not just connected to the Kozlov organization. He's running a trafficking network through the port that involves at least 12 other individuals, including 2 customs officials and a federal immigration officer." Elena felt the familiar chill of fear as Lorenzo studied the information, his expression hardening into the cold focus she'd learned to associate with his business mode. But there was something different about his anger this time, something more personal and protective that made her realize how completely he'd integrated her and Sophia into his priorities. "Recommendations?" Lorenzo asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that commanded instant respect from his people. Full elimination of the network would require coordinated action across multiple locations, but it's feasible. "However, sir, there's something else. Marcus has been making inquiries about your mother's weekly mass at St. Anthony's. He knows about your family connections." Elena saw Lorenzo's jaw tighten with a rage that was entirely different from his business calculations. His mother was sacred territory, as untouchable as Sophia had become. Marcus had just escalated from threatening Elena's family to threatening Lorenzo's, which meant the gloves were about to come off completely. "Elena, I need you to pack a bag for you and Sophia," Lorenzo said, his tone carefully neutral but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "My cousin Mateo has a safe house in the Keys. You'll be completely protected there while we handle this." Elena felt her stomach drop with familiar fear, but not the fear of physical danger. This was the fear of being sent away, of Lorenzo making the decision to protect her by removing her from his life rather than allowing her to face the risks that came with loving him. "No," she said quietly, her voice gaining strength as Sophia looked up from her butterfly pancake with concern. "I'm not running anymore, Lorenzo. If you're ending this, we're doing it together. Elena, this isn't a discussion. Marcus has crossed lines that require a response he won't survive. I won't have you and Sophia anywhere near that kind of violence." Sophia set down her fork, her 80-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of the adult conflict she was witnessing. "Are you sending us away because you don't want us anymore, Papa?" The question hit Lorenzo like a physical blow, his controlled facade cracking as he knelt beside Sophia's chair to meet her eyes directly. "Never, Piccola. I'm trying to keep you safe because I love you and Elena more than anything in the world. Sometimes keeping people safe means making hard choices. But we're a family now," Sophia said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "Families stay together when bad things happen. Elena taught me that when Mama and Daddy died." Elena felt tears prick behind her eyes as she watched Lorenzo struggle with the same choice she'd been making for months. How to balance love with protection, how to keep the people you cared about safe without pushing them away. "Lorenzo," Elena said, moving to stand behind Sophia's chair so her hands rested on her sister's shoulders. "Sophia's right. We're a family now, which means we face the hard things together. I won't let you carry this alone anymore." Before Lorenzo could respond, his phone rang with a call from his mother. Elena could hear the panic in Maria Castillo's voice even from across the room, rapid Spanish that made Lorenzo's expression turn murderous. When he hung up, his voice was deadly quiet. Marcus grabbed my mother outside church. He wants to trade her for Elena and Sophia. Elena felt the world tilt sideways as the full implications hit her. Marcus had kidnapped a 70-year-old woman, had violated the most sacred rule of Lorenzo's world by targeting an innocent family member. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, no possibility of a peaceful resolution. Where? Elena asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The old warehouse district where Gabriella died. He's not being subtle about the symbolism. Lorenzo was already moving toward his office, his phone in his hand as he began coordinating what Elena recognized as a military-level operation. She followed, ignoring his attempts to send her away, and listened as he deployed resources and personnel with the efficiency of someone who'd planned for exactly this scenario. Elena, I need you to take Sophia and go to the safe house now, Lorenzo said when he finished his calls. This ends tonight, but I won't risk either of you being used against me. Elena stepped closer, close enough to see the pain and fear he was hiding beneath his controlled exterior. He was terrified of losing them, terrified of making the same mistakes that had cost him Gabriella, terrified of choosing wrong when the stakes were so impossibly high. Lorenzo, I love you, Elena said, the words coming easily despite the circumstances. I love you enough to trust your strength and your judgment and your ability to bring your mother home safely. But I also love you enough to not let you face this believing you might lose us no matter what choice you make. She reached up to cup his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze directly. When you come back tonight, Sophia and I will be here waiting for you. Not because you sent us away to keep us safe, but because we chose to stay and build a life with you. Because this is our home now, and you're our family, and families don't abandon each other when things get dangerous. Lorenzo pulled her against him, holding her tight enough that she could feel his heart racing beneath his controlled exterior. Promise me, he whispered against her hair. Promise me you'll be here when this is over. I promise, Elena said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. We'll be here, and we'll be yours, and we'll figure out how to make this work no matter what it takes. 6 hours later, Elena was reading Sophia a bedtime story when Lorenzo returned, his mother safe and unharmed. The Marcus problem permanently resolved along with the entire trafficking network that had been terrorizing families like theirs. When Maria Castillo met Elena and Sophia the next morning, the elegant older woman took one look at how Lorenzo watched them and immediately pulled Elena into a fierce hug. Bienvenida a la familia, she said in accented English. Welcome to the family. It's about time my son found someone worth coming home to. As Elena watched Sophia show Lorenzo's mother the butterfly pancakes he'd taught her to make, she realized that everything she'd been running from had led her exactly where she needed to be. In Lorenzo's arms, in his dangerous but loving world, with a family that had chosen each other rather than simply accepting the bonds of blood. The threat was over, but the love they'd built would last forever. The morning after Marcus's death, Elena woke to silence, so profound it felt like peace made tangible. For the first time in over a year, she opened her eyes without immediately scanning for threats, without calculating escape routes or checking that Sophia was safely within arm's reach. The nightmare was over, truly over, and the relief was so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. Lorenzo was already awake beside her, his dark eyes soft with the kind of contentment Elena had never seen on his face before. The tension that had defined his shoulders for weeks was gone, replaced by a relaxed certainty that spoke of problems solved permanently and futures that could finally be planned. How do you feel? He asked, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her bare shoulder. Free, Elena whispered, the word carrying more weight than she'd realized it could. For the first time since my parents died, I feel completely free. Lorenzo's smile was small but genuine, the expression of a man who'd found something he'd never expected to possess. Elena realized that Marcus's elimination had freed Lorenzo as well, not just from the immediate threat, but from the fear that he might lose another person he loved to violence he couldn't prevent. Sophia appeared in the doorway wearing her school uniform and an expression of barely contained excitement, her backpack already strapped to her shoulders despite the early hour. Papa, Elena, I don't want to be late for school today because Jessica promised to show me her butterfly collection and Mrs. Peterson said we're starting multiplication tables and I want to tell everyone that the bad man is gone and we don't have to move anymore. Elena felt her chest tighten with emotion as she watched Lorenzo's face transform at Sophia's casual use of Papa, the title that had become as natural as breathing over the past few weeks. This was what normal looked like for Sophia now. School friends and multiplication tables, and the absolute certainty that the adults in her life would keep her safe. After they'd seen Sophia off to school with her usual security detail, now reduced to a single bodyguard rather than the small army that had been protecting her during the crisis, Elena found Lorenzo in his office staring out the window at the city he commanded. "What happens now?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. The question that had been haunting her since she'd woken up was whether their relationship could survive the transition from crisis-driven intensity to everyday reality. Lorenzo turned from the window, his expression serious but warm. "Now we decide what kind of life we want to build together, the kind of family we want to create." Elena's breath caught as Lorenzo moved around the desk to kneel beside her chair, producing a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. The gesture was so traditional, so completely at odds with everything dangerous and unconventional about their relationship, that Elena felt laughter and tears threatening simultaneously. "Elena Moreau," Lorenzo said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of vulnerability that made her heart race. "Will you marry me? Will you let me adopt Sophia and make this family official in every way that matters?" Elena stared at the ring, a classic solitaire that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated, perfect for a life that would need to balance Lorenzo's public persona with their private happiness. But more than the ring, more than the proposal itself, it was the mention of adoption that made Elena's decision easy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with the conviction that came from absolute certainty. "Yes to everything. To marriage and adoption and building whatever kind of life we can create together." Lorenzo's hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, the band fitting perfectly because of course he'd somehow managed to determine her size without her noticing. When he kissed her, Elena tasted promise and commitment, and the kind of future she'd stopped believing was possible. That afternoon, when they picked Sophia up from school together, Lorenzo let Elena deliver the news. Sophia's reaction was everything Elena had hoped for and more. Pure joy followed by immediate practical concerns about whether she could change her last name to Castillo and whether Maria could teach her to make Lorenzo's favorite cookies. The wedding planning took 3 weeks, a remarkably short timeline that was possible only because of Lorenzo's resources and Maria Castillo's determination to welcome Elena and Sophia into the family properly. Elena found herself swept up in a whirlwind of dress fittings and menu tastings and flower arrangements, all orchestrated by a woman who'd been waiting years for her son to find someone worth marrying. Elena had worried that Sophia might feel displaced by the wedding preparations, but her sister threw herself into the role of flower girl with an enthusiasm that made everyone smile. She practiced her walk down the aisle daily, using the compound's long hallways as her rehearsal space, and appointed herself Lorenzo's official advisor on all matters relating to the ceremony. The wedding itself was held in the garden of the compound, a space that Lorenzo's landscaper had transformed into something that belonged in a fairy tale. White flowers and soft lighting created an atmosphere of elegant romance, while discreet security measures ensured that their celebration would be both beautiful and safe. Elena's wedding dress was simple but stunning, a design that made her feel both elegant and comfortable, appropriate for a ceremony that was as much about family as it was about romance. As she walked down the aisle, Sophia preceding her with a basket of rose petals and a smile bright enough to power the city, Elena felt like she was finally stepping into the life she was meant to live. Lorenzo waited for her at the altar wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo and an expression of wonder that suggested he couldn't quite believe this moment was real. When Elena reached him, he took her hands in his and spoke his vows with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything that mattered to him. "Elena, you and Sophia saved me from a life I didn't realize was half empty. You taught me what it means to protect something out of love rather than obligation, what it feels like to come home to people who choose to stay. I promise to love you both, to protect you both, and to build a life with you that's worthy of the trust you've placed in me." Elena's own vows came from the deepest part of her heart, words she'd never imagined herself saying to anyone. "Lorenzo, You showed me that strength doesn't have to mean loneliness, that accepting help doesn't make me weak. You gave Sophia the father she needed, and me the partner I'd stopped believing existed. I promise to love you exactly as you are, to stand beside you in whatever challenges we face, and to trust in the family we've created together." When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Sophia cheered loudly enough to make the entire wedding party laugh. The reception that followed was an elegant affair that somehow managed to feel intimate despite the number of guests, a celebration that honored both Lorenzo's position in his world and the quiet family they'd built together. Maria Castillo gave a toast that brought tears to Elena's eyes, welcoming her and Sophia to the family with words that emphasized belonging and permanence. Lorenzo's cousins and business associates offered their respect and protection, making it clear that Elena and Sophia were now under the umbrella of the Castillo name and everything that represented. But the moment that made Elena's heart overflow was when Sophia stood up during the reception, barely tall enough to be seen over the table, and announced to the entire room that she was the luckiest girl in the world because she had the best papa and the best big sister, and now they were all going to live together forever. The adoption papers were finalized the week after the wedding, a ceremony that was smaller than the wedding but somehow more emotional. When the judge declared Sophia legally a Castillo, the little girl burst into tears of joy and launched herself into Lorenzo's arms with such force that he nearly fell backward in his chair. 6 months later, Elena stood in the same kitchen where she'd first felt safe, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her pregnant belly as she watched Lorenzo help Sophia with her homework at the kitchen island. The domestic scene was so perfectly normal that it still sometimes took Elena's breath away. Sophia was thriving in ways that amazed Elena daily. Her grades were excellent, her friendships were healthy and age-appropriate, and the nightmares that had plagued her during the Marcus situation had faded to distant memory. More importantly, Sophia had the kind of confidence that came from absolute security, the knowledge that the adults in her life were capable of protecting what mattered most. Lorenzo had undergone his own transformation, though his changes were more subtle. He still ran his empire with the same strategic intelligence and controlled authority, but there was a softness to him now that hadn't existed before Elena and Sophia. His business associates had learned to accommodate his new priorities, understanding that family dinner was non-negotiable and that school events took precedence over all but the most urgent matters. Elena's pregnancy had been a surprise, but a welcome one, and watching Lorenzo's wonder at the idea of a baby who would know only love and safety from birth was one of Elena's greatest joys. Sophia was already planning everything from nursery decorations to the detailed schedule of big sister duties she intended to fulfill. The evening routine had become sacred time for all three of them. After Sophia finished her homework and Lorenzo completed his business calls, they would gather in the living room for what Sophia called family time. Sometimes they watched movies, sometimes they read together, sometimes they simply talked about their days and made plans for the weekend. Tonight, as Elena settled beside Lorenzo on the couch with Sophia curled up between them, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, she'd been a terrified woman with no options and no hope, convinced that she'd failed at the most important job she'd ever had. Now she was married to a man who loved her completely, raising a daughter who felt safe enough to dream about the future, and carrying a child who would know from birth what it meant to be cherished and protected. The security system chimed softly, indicating an approach to the main gate, and Elena watched Lorenzo's expression shift into the alert focus that meant business. But instead of the tension that such interruptions once brought, there was now a sense of routine, of problems that would be handled efficiently so that family time could resume. Ramirez appeared in the doorway, his expression respectful but urgent. "Sir, there's a situation at the gate. A teenage girl with a younger boy, both injured. They're asking for help, specifically asking for the man who saved the lady and little girl who lived here." Elena felt her heart clench with recognition and sympathy. Another family in crisis, another desperate situation that had led them to Lorenzo's door seeking salvation from someone they'd heard was strong enough to protect them. Lorenzo looked at Elena, the question in his eyes asking for her input, rather than simply making the decision alone. It was a small thing, that consultation, but it represented everything that had changed about how Lorenzo approached his protective instincts. Elena nodded, her hand covering his as Sophia looked up from her book with interest rather than fear. "Help them," Elena said quietly. "We all know what it's like to need someone strong enough to make the monsters go away." Lorenzo's smile was soft and proud as he kissed Elena's forehead and ruffled Sophia's hair. "Take care of our family," he said, the possessive pronouns carrying a warmth that never failed to make Elena's chest tight with happiness. "I'll be back soon." As Lorenzo left to handle whatever crisis had arrived at their door, Elena settled more comfortably against the couch cushions and returned her attention to Sophia's animated description of the science project she was planning. This was their life now, love and safety and the quiet confidence that came from knowing they'd found their place in the world. Outside, Elena could hear Lorenzo's voice as he spoke to the frightened teenagers who'd sought his protection, offering the same steady reassurance he'd given her that first night when Sophia had knocked on his door at midnight. Some things never changed about Lorenzo Castillo. He would always be the man people turned to when they needed someone strong enough to fight the darkness. The difference was that now, when he finished saving whoever needed saving, he would come home to a family who loved him completely and chose him daily. Elena and Sophia would be waiting with dinner and homework help and bedtime stories, ready to remind him that strength was only meaningful when it protected something worth loving. As Sophia curled up against her side and began reading aloud from her favorite book, Elena smiled and let herself believe in the promise of tomorrow. They'd found each other in the darkness, built something beautiful from the fragments of their broken pasts, and created a family that was strong enough to weather any storm. For those of you who've ever wondered whether love can really conquer all, Elena and Sophia and Lorenzo were living proof that sometimes the most unexpected protectors become the most precious family. Sometimes, knocking on the right door at midnight can change everything. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is trust someone else to help carry the weight of keeping the people you love safe. In Lorenzo Castillo's world, family meant everything, and Elena and Sophia had become his everything. And that, Elena thought as she pressed a kiss to Sophia's head and felt their baby flutter gently in her womb, was the only ending that mattered.